Hello, I'm Dapper Dan Gavoston, and I own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, including the annuals, which definitely count.
And I'm Mischievous Mark Ginocchio, and I own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, including the annuals, including the negative issues, including so many random comics with the word Amazing Spider-Man on it. But like the fact of the matter is, if it's not in the main continuity 1 to 9, whatever it's up to right now, Dan, it just doesn't count, including the annuals. They don't count. So let's move on from it, all right? Why are we still doing this?
In the spirit of moving on, Mark, I will make my official announcement on this episode of the show that I have purchased the -1 issue of Amazing Spider-Man and have it in my collection now. So you did it. You got me to buy it, Mark. And now my collection is complete.
All right.
So there you go. I also purchased the -1 of Spectacular and...
Ooh.
Regular adjective list, just because I was like, God damn it, I will not forget about this. And those are going to have a place in my collection before they slip my memory of their existence, as it has done everybody who's read those books. So anyway, I just wanted to put it in the record that you and I have the same number of Amazing Spider-Man books now.
I mean, probably, until I move the goalposts again, but keep talking.
Don't worry, I'm actively looking for ways to move the goalpost. But thank you, everybody, for joining us for our 5th episode of Season 6 of the Amazing Spider Talk, the show where two fans and collectors uncover the strange, fun, arbitrary, and fascinating history of the Spider-Man comic universe.
If you want to swing along with us on our journey through Spidey's past, present, and future, subscribe to Amazing Spider Talk on your favorite podcast app. I mean, there might even be like some -1 podcast apps out there, and you could use those too.
Don't use those. I don't even know what. We just play backwards. Is that what's happening?
It's like the RFK Jr. Podcast app. I don't know. Anyway.
I mean, if you play this episode backwards, we're secretly sending messages to Mephisto. But anyway. This podcast exists because of the support of our Patreon members. If you want to receive early episodes, exclusive artwork, and keep this podcast going, long may it rain, go to AmazingSpiderTalk.com and consider joining our Patreon.
Every episode of this season features artwork by comic artist Nick Cagnetti and is available to our Patreon members, unlettered and in stunning high resolution. Of course, you can find Nick Cagnetti on the graphic novel Pink Lemonade. Go get it now at your local comic book shop.
Yeah. In this season of the Amazing Spider Talk, we're going back to the mid-'80s when the Amazing Spider-Man title was handed over to one of the most legendary creative pairings in comics, who were just starting their creative partnership, Tom DeFalco and Ron Frenz. It was a time of immense change in the comics industry, but together Tom and Ron returned Spider-Man to its Ditko-inspired roots to create one of the most beloved runs on the title.
On today's show, we're going to be talking about how the ripple effects of the larger comics industry shift towards a greater darkness, or grim darkness, if you will, and maturity would find its way into the pages of Spider-Man comics. While Tom DeFalco and Ron Frenz held to a classical tradition of hoo-ha, Silver Age comic book storytelling, in the pages of Spectacular Spider-Man, a new writer on the comic scene, Peter David, would take after the likes of Frank Miller to bring a darker tone to Peter Parker's adventures.
Yeah, so we're going to be specifically talking about the classic Spider-Man story, The Death of Jean DeWolf, which can be found in issues 107 to 110 of Peter Parker, The Spectacular Spider-Man, or just The Spectacular Spider-Man. Some libraries counted under P, some of them counted under S. I mean, you know, good luck navigating all of this, which is to say you can often find these issues in like collected in trades or in reprints, or the original issues don't typically cost that much to buy. They're, you know, like I said, collected editions, but it's also all available on the Marvel Digital Marketplace and Marvel Unlimited. It's weird because it's this kind of like weird island in like the comic run on Marvel Unlimited where Spectacular to either side of this story has not yet been uploaded, but they were sure to get The Death of Jean DeWolf up. I can't even begin to speak to like what's on Marvel Unlimited and why and their priorities there. It's still missing the JMD run on Spectacular Spider-Man, which is baffling to me. But at least we have the death of Jean DeWolf, so you can go check out issues 107 to 110 of the Spectacular Spider-Man Volume 1. Mark, getting into this, we're talking about this era of comics. And when we talk about like Ron Frenz and Tom DeFalco, they were doing their own thing, as we said in our kind of opening episode of this season. This kind of Silver Age, as they would call it, hoo-ha style of comics that was becoming a rarity in the comic scene by the mid-'80s. Can you tell us a little more historically about like why this was true, what was happening in the comic scene? This is 1985. Like, what's going on that would make Amazing Spider-Man so different?
Yeah, absolutely, Dan. I mean, it's funny. When we did our intro for the Roger Stern season, we kept kind of prefacing it by saying, comics were getting darker, which, in terms of the early 80s was very true. You had Frank Miller and Klaus Johnson doing their famed Daredevil run, and that was kind of like the point, the patient zero, if you will, of darker superhero comics. But by the mid 80s, specifically by 85, it was kind of like the floodgates had opened. And, just to give you a sense of context here, some of the big books that had come out either immediately before or immediately after the death of Jean DeWolf and Peter David's run on Spectacular included from DC, Crisis on Infinite Earths, which was their big miniseries, kind of more or less like the first big true crossover. I know Secret Wars kind of takes its claims for that as well, but Crisis on Infinite Earths was this very sophisticated attempt to streamline the timelines of the DC universe, which were kind of all over the place by that point. You had Alan Moore's run on Swamp Thing, which was considered a very groundbreaking, character-driven, kind of psychedelic type run. You also had Alan Moore run on Miracle Man, which, Miracle Man is a whole other thing. I mean, I don't have a degree in Miracle Man, so I'm not even going to attempt to explain it, but it's all about copyright infringements and dark characters and heads exploding. It's everything you'd want in an Alan Moore comic. Around this time, we also had the debut of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which, I mean, not for nothing, was kind of a spoof on the Frank Miller Daredevil run for the most part. I mean, all the way from the origin issue to through the first 20 or 30 issues of this book.
Splinter is Stick. I mean, there's really no way around it. Yeah.
I mean, I know probably some of the hardcore fans understand this already, but like, in terms of like the late 80s, early 90s cartoon and the movies and all that kind of stuff, these Ninja Turtles had nothing to, they were nowhere similar to what, kind of the very big pop culture phenomenon of Ninja Turtles ended up being. Immediately after the run of Jean DeWolf, Frank Miller returned to Daredevil and did Born Again, which is, probably considered by some to be the greatest Daredevil story of all time. It's going to be a Marvel show on Disney Plus. It's going to, bring the official return of Daredevil to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And then, like within like 6 months or so of the end of the publication of Jean DeWolf's storyline, we had Watchmen, the great Alan Moore storyline of that is, basically like a total breakdown of like what the Silver Age of superhero comics was supposed to be. And of course, The Dark Knight Returns, which was, his middle-aged dark Batman going against the Reagan inspired Superman. I mean, this is all very dark, politically motivated. This is what it was, a massive shift in tone and style, artistic style, visual style, storytelling style, the kind of words and verbiage used in comics. Like, this all shifted around the time that this Spider-Man comic book storyline was published. So
I would also add in the way that people talked about comics change.
Correct.
Like I'm not a historian in that regard, but like I would imagine this is the era of the words graphic novel.
Yes,
coming
100%.
out,
Yes, I mean specifically Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns. Those are considered like the advent of the graphic novel,
yeah.
where you could go into a bookstore or a library and you were checking out comic books, but it was almost like literature in that regard.
Right. And so, like, again, in that venue, like a more Silver Age inspired Amazing Spider Man really stands out. It is the exact thing that Alan Moore's books are in many ways critiquing or commenting on. That's not to say that there wasn't some sophistication and modern elements brought into the DeFalco Frenz run, but it really stands apart from all of these things. Mark, like we don't get a chance to often talk about books outside of the purview of Spider-Man. Are these books some of your favorites? Do you prefer the kind of hoo-ha stuff? Like, where do you stand on this kind of era of comics?
I mean, look, I like to think of myself as a pretty open-minded reader in terms of I like it all, Dan, is kind of the bottom line. But the fact of the matter is, and I'm not saying this colors my opinion of it, but all of these comics that I just rattled off, if you go to like, best of lists on like CBR or like other big comic book sites, I mean, these are all like consistently in like the top 10 comic book stories or runs of all time, especially like, Alan Moore Swamp Thing and Crisis and Daredevil Born Again, Dark Knight Returns, Watchmen. I mean, for me, like, I certainly appreciate the sophistication of these stories. I have read pretty much everything here. The only one that like I have to be honest that does kind of leave me cold is Miracle Man. I mean, like I love me some Alan Moore, but like that storyline just kind of, I don't know, it's just a little too deconstructed superhero storytelling for me. I mean, it's kind of like, it goes even further than Watchmen does in that regard. I will also admit, like, as time goes on and I read more and more comics, both of this era, earlier and later, these books, like, as much as I like them, they also kind of become easier to both poke holes in and kind of make fun of in terms of the darkness of it. But like at the end of the day, like if you're asking me what are some of your non-favorite Spider-Man stories, I mean, I'm going to talk about certainly Born Again. I'm going to talk about Watchmen. I probably like Batman Year One more than Dark Knight Returns, but Dark Knight Returns is a great read in that regard. So yeah, I like them. I like them a lot. I like them in this context. What about you?
I agree with just about everything you said. I mean, like, again, I also like Batman Year One more than Dark Knight Returns, but it's been a long time since I've read that book, and I feel like its criticisms of Reagan were probably sharper in the mid '80s. But although it's always, I guess, open field day for criticizing the Reagan era, but. I wasn't. I was barely born to experience it, so far be it from me. But I mean, like any day of the week, you wouldn't have to twist my arm to get me to say that I think like Daredevil Born Again is one of the best books Marvel's ever published, if not the best book Marvel's ever published. Certainly better than Maximum Carnage. And Watchmen is like one of my favorite pieces of literature ever.
Yes.
Like I have a Dave Gibbons signed copy of that book with he drew Rorschach in, and like that's a real treasure of mine. I can't tell you how many people I've bought that book for. You actually got me to read Crisis on Infinite Earths, and I thought that was a really interesting read.
Yep.
Really a hugely influential book. All of the multiverse stuff that we're getting now, really, like that book is the kind of like, the focal point of where that kind of took root.
Yep.
I read Swamp Thing for the first time a couple years ago. That's a really haunting book. I mean, these are great comics, but they are. I think Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was probably like 2 or 3 decades ahead of its time.
Yes.
Like to already be making fun of this stuff. Like you guys are taking yourself so seriously, but it's a bunch of adult turtles running around. You know what I mean? Like that's the inherent joke is like, is this really the medium you're choosing to be so serious about?
Right.
And I agree with that some of the times. I do, and I think in our modern reviews we lament sometimes when the book takes itself so seriously, so as to as Alan Scherstl coined on our show, to become grim, not grim dark, but grim dumb.
Yes.
And yeah, I do. We'll get into talking about the ripple effects of some of these comics as this episode goes on. But I will say, when this approach is good, it's awesome, and these are some of my favorite books ever. Including Frank Miller's Daredevil run. I mean, that is an unassailable run of comics. And bold of Marvel to release that. It's chock full of very grim scenes that I think even today would be considered somewhat shocking. So,
yeah, I mean, to your point, Dan, I mean, the whole impetus behind Daredevil Born Again is that Karen Page sells Matt Murdock's secret identity as Daredevil because she's basically prostituting herself. I mean, these are themes that were certainly unheard of in the Silver Age and even in the majority of the Bronze Age of comics in terms of the 70s and early 80s. So I mean, yes, very very dark, and I mean, we're gonna probably it should be a drinking game how many times we use the word dark in this episode. But anyway, but let me also give a little bit of background about the death of Jean DeWolf storyline. So just to let people know what exactly are we talking about. I mean, again, for reading purposes, we're talking about Spectacular Spider-Man issues 107 to 110. This was considered Peter David's big break in comics. It was basically his second byline for Marvel. And at the time, the editor of the Spider-Man books, Jim Owsley / Christopher Priest, what he had said, now this was on his blog, and for the longest time, Christopher Priest's blog was kind of his only really running dialogue about Spider-Man until Amazing Spider Talk had him on our show in our 200th episode, so go back and download that one, folks. But yeah. He said about the Peter David run specifically, I didn't much care for the whimsical tone of Spectacular Spider-Man and tried to nudge writer Al Milgrom out of the seat in favor of the brilliant newcomer Peter David. I put Peter David and Rich Buckler on Spectacular, focusing on stories with a serious grown-up tone and more complex themes. Peter David in interviews basically has credited Owsley / Priest for wanting to kill Jean DeWolf. He actually wanted to use Jean DeWolf as part of his run as kind of a an authority figure for Spider-Man to kind of play off of. But regardless, David was into the idea that was pitched to him because he wanted to write a story where, quote, Spider-Man was confronted by a villain who committed crimes so heinous, so appalling that Spider-Man was pushed to the edge and over. And additionally, he thought it was, quote unquote, unrealistic that superheroes could turn an on-off switch in their fights, which is an interesting point. So Owsley and Peter David, they basically banged out this entire plot in a marathon session at Peter's house. And then additionally, Peter David credits the artist, Rich Buckler, who had passed away a few years ago, for creating the visual motif that was, quote unquote, Spidey meets Hill Street Blues. So you have any thoughts on that before we get into this, Dan? I mean, it definitely sets the table for what we're about to get, for sure, right?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of this being Peter David's big break in comics, I do think a lot of the elements that you can associate with a Peter David comic, come in here. I don't think he's quite as introspective and cerebral as J.M. DeMatteis is, mm-hmm. But his stories do often deal with these kind of fragmented superhero characters who are confronted by mixed pulls in their superherodom. I'm thinking of his Hulk run and things like that, and I think if you read this book in a vacuum, the writing stands out, and the art as well.
Yes.
It's very different than what came before, but there is a reading this, it's oh, this is a writer's book. Yep. There's a real voice here, and so in terms of Peter David, I think it really stands out, and that Spidey meets Hill Street Blues, like there is a incredible groundedness to this. It really reminds me of like 70s crime pictures. There's like even Peter in some of the images in this book like doesn't really look like himself. He looks like this kind of like real guy you could bump into on the street, and that can be alarming as well as kind of exciting to see it in the pages of this book. Like it can be kind of inconsistent, but it is consistently different than what we've been getting up to this point.
Definitely. And now, just in terms of some other unique themes and tropes that were more or less introduced here, not necessarily introduced in comics, but introduced in terms of Spider-Man comics. Although some of these were kind of unique for comics too, I should say. The first is the idea of like killing off a central character, in this case, Jean DeWolf, but like not in battle, but basically like off panel, or in this, she was in her sleep here. I mean, we kind of see the after effects of the murder. We don't actually see the murder, and it's not like she's going down in the line of duty and gets killed like the way Captain Stacy was in Amazing Spider-Man 90. Additionally, like the Sin Eater itself as a villain, while we've had not super powered villains before, like this was just, he was just a psycho with a shotgun. I mean, there was really no powers to speak of here, no motivations besides I just want to kill people who I believe have sinned, and then kind of a format thing, and I think this kind of lends itself to what you had just alluded to earlier, Dan, which is like the fact that this was kind of like a writer's book, or at least like a creator's book. They did the bylines for Peter and Buckler and all that on the final page in like white text, kind of like basically like the end credits of a movie, and I just like it's very like, even frankly describing it right now, like I kind of get like little chills talking about it, because like it really is like off-putting, but in a good way as a reader when you hit that for the first time, because you're just like it's very self-aware of the fact that this is different. This is of a higher level of storytelling, if you will, or at least aspires to be. And it's also, it just, I like it, frankly. I like the fact that like you get to the end and you're like, who did this? It's like, oh, like, kind of like when you're watching a movie and you get to the end, you're like, who was that person? Oh, okay, you know what I mean? Like it's like a celebration of the medium itself, where you can get to the end and then kind of celebrate who did the work. So these are all very cool things. I mean, do any of these three bits here kind of have an impact on you in any kind of meaningful way, or are you just kind of like, meh, whatever, Mark?
Oh, no. I mean, I think these are really big deal. I mean, we can talk about like the death of Jean DeWolf as a like fridging,
Yes.
like and I think that would certainly be a knock I would have against this comic. And adding to the historical element, Jean had not really been a character in the book in some time. Like, she was a cop who was around and then kind of had disappeared into the background, and this was like when people like say like like the classic deaths in the pages of Spider-Man, they might include Jean DeWolf, but like mainly like she's someone who really only has popularity in her death, and she's not really even present in the story in any way. Like she was a kind of a bit player for a little while and then disappeared, mostly when Peter was with Felicia, right. So and there is a sort of like implication in this story that Jean had some kind of romantic feelings for Spider-Man that other writers have fleshed out. The villain with a shotgun, I think is interesting. We hadn't really, again, gone that much into the psychoanalyzing characters in the pages of Spider-Man. People were evil because they were evil. Yeah, yep. Norman Osborn had some kind of psychosis going on, but it's a kind of like, like whatever, the hee-haw, like he's just evil, flip a switch, and people would flesh that out later and give it some rich psychological context. But like, this was a guy who had a, potion explode on him, and it made him switch back and forth between good and evil, not in the way that the deep psychology of the Sin Eater was here. And so I think it does open the book up for, some of the more complicated psychologies we've gotten in the years since for these characters. Like, I don't think, the character of Eddie Brock Venom would probably exist without Sin Eater carving out a lane for that kind of thing. Like a character that is so psychologically tormented that he's willing to commit suicide. So like, I do think that's important. And then just the elevation of, Peter David and the art team in the back of the book. It reminds me of something like this book gives me a real like French Connection, Dirty Harry vibe, to it, and like kind of splashing the director's name or whatever at the end. We're in this is post 70s where the director ruled everything in movies, but like comics seem to be kind of coming around to that idea. You can see here in the 80s. So I think these are all really important. So Mark, before we get into talking about the story itself, in detail and our thoughts about it and all that stuff, I thought perhaps, if you don't mind, if you could summarize the story for people who maybe haven't read it or need a refresher, and then we can talk just kind of our overall opinions about the story before we break it all down. Absolutely,
Dan. So basically, this storyline is set up by the fact that Jean DeWolf, who's the captain of the police force, she is murdered in her sleep, and it kind of like sends like shockwaves through New York City. Like who did this? Like who kills a cop? It's very kind of unnerving and horrifying. Spider-Man himself is he's like, I got to get to the bottom of this. He's basically like out there acting like a shoe leather reporter, trying to find out what happened here. He's talking to cops. He meets this one police officer who's been assigned to the case named Stan Carter. So he's kind of like, not buddy copying with Stan, but like, just kind of, hanging out and picking his brain and figuring out what's going on here. And in the background of all this, we Daredevil is also a factor here. Matt Murdock is kind of like set up as this almost like a juxtaposition to Peter in terms of Peter is Spider-Man is like the vigilante crime fighter, and whereas Matt Murdock, because he doubles as both Daredevil and a lawyer, is kind of trying to follow the idea of law and justice and innocent until proven guilty and all that. The Sin Eater ends up striking again and kills a judge that is a friend, and Matt Murdock is actually witness to it, but like because he won't give away his identity as Daredevil, he basically lets this murder happen in front of him. It turns out that Stan Carter, the cop that's been assigned to the case, actually is the Sin Eater. So Spider-Man finally, the Sin Eater is about to actually kill Betty Brant. Fate intervenes. Spider-Man shows up at the scene and it basically starts beating the ever-loving crap out of the Sin Eater, to the point that you kind of get the sense that Spider-Man is about to kill the guy, and then Daredevil intervenes, and then Spider-Man and Daredevil have like a multi-page melee where it kind of like sets up this idea of like law and order and justice and vengeance and who's right and who's wrong and lots of moral quandaries, and then the ultimate upshot of the whole storyline is that Peter and Matt learn each other's secret identities, and the Sin Eater is apprehended. Is that a decent synopsis of this? I know I skipped over parts of it, but that's kind of the high level points of it.
Yeah. So, Mark, we've had hot takes on the show before, and I think we're about to get into maybe one of our hotter takes here on the show. Let's talk about our overall thoughts about this story, As many have deemed it a classic Spider-Man story.
Yes.
What do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, similar to those other storylines that I rattled off at the very beginning of this episode, Dan. I mean, like, this Death of Jean DeWolf is consistently listed as like a top 5 or 10 Spider-Man story if you go to like the major comic book sites and whatnot. For me personally, I am of the opinion, Mark always with his nuanced opinions. Like, it's not about the marriage, it's about the stories, right? Well, in this case,
Yeah.
I think this is a very good comic book story. I think this is a terrible Spider-Man story that is very tone deaf to the character, and is kind of a good demonstration of how not to write this character. It has had some positive influences. You referred to Venom and Eddie Brock earlier. Like these are undeniable, but like I feel like bringing in this degree of grim darkness and kind of cerebral Watchmen-esque storytelling into the world of Spider-Man is a huge mistake. Even if I think this is, in a vacuum, a really good comic book story. What about you, Dan?
I feel very similarly. I think a lot of my venom towards how this book writes Spider-Man bleeds into how good of a story I think it is, because I think it is. It is a well-written story, but there's a huge caveat to that, which is it does not understand its main character at all.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
this. There are moments in this that I'm like, I don't even recognize Spider-Man. And maybe that's the point, is that like he has been driven so far that like who he was before is no longer recognizable. But if that's the case, I don't think it earns that level of character change for Spider-Man. If it was like, say, a guy that shotgunned Mary Jane or something like that, maybe I would buy it. Even then, I don't think I would. We're going to talk about kind of like subsequent influences of this, and I'm going to point out a story there that I think does a similar thing to this, but doesn't betray who Spider-Man is in his core essence. There's a moment I think that stood out to me very early on in this comic where I was like, yeah, no, this is not Spider-Man, where Spider-Man's in a fight and he gets like hit really hard, and he describes tasting the blood in his mouth. Yep. And how it like fuels him to like want to fight harder. And I'm like, that's not Spider-Man. That's the Punisher. Like, yeah. And I think this story would actually work really well as like a Punisher Daredevil story. If you have a character who already has a moral code of like, like eye for an eye, and like, and I will take out the people that are sinning, because Spider-Man has no hesitancy here. Like, Daredevil is supposed to be the voice of reason, but it's kind of should be the opposite way around. I like the idea of vigilantism as fascism versus, like Matt Murdock, who is a like representative of the law and that everybody deserves a fair trial, and et cetera, et cetera. Except that's never who Spider-Man really has ever been. Like, right. Yes. I mean, yes, he's a vigilante, but I've never seen him as like the more fascistic version of that, which is why I think I like the sequel to the story more. Mm-hmm. Because in that story, Spider-Man is protecting the Sin Eater from the mob, and Correct. He is like embracing the idea of reform for this villain. And that's the humanistic approach that I expect from a character like Spider-Man. Yeah, it's a good story, like in a vacuum. Like you said, it is not a Spider-Man story, and that I think really keeps me from embracing it as a really great story, because like I can't even keep track of the main character, and this thing can't really be read in a vacuum. Like it is a part of the Spider-Man lore and mythos, and one that's not referenced a ton. And I think it's because it doesn't mesh with the character as we know him. Although I will say, I think it's had a profound impact on the way the character has been written, and we'll get to that later on in the show. So those are our kind of hot takes on the death of Gene DeWolf. If you want to stop the podcast here because you think we're so wrong, fine. But like I would say hear us out, because we're going to unpack like some of our thoughts on the pluses and minuses of this story. Which is to say, let's get into the first topic here, which is the Sin Eater as a villain. I really dig the Sin Eater, and we talked about that on our Bad Guys episode. How do you think the Sin Eater works within the story?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, Dan, super quick, that, you know, if us being wrong was like reason for people to stop listening, I mean, you know, they would have stopped listening about 250 episodes ago, or maybe more than that. I mean, you know,
that's
anyway.
Generous. Yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay. So the Sin Eater himself as a villain, I mean, like, let's look at this, because, like, you know, on one breath, like, Spider-Man is not new to street level villains, but obviously there is just something inherently different about the Sin Eater in terms of his grittiness, and I'm going to use the term again. I'm holding my beer right now. His darkness. You know, you look at previous street level characters. You know, I always think of like the Crime Master, the Enforcers, Green Goblin, Hobgoblin. I mean, like, all of these characters, you know, like there's no fancy Dan or Ox here. They don't have fantastic costumes and weapons. There's no pumpkin bombs and masks with big grinning goblin faces on it. You know, this guy is, you know, he kind of, you know, in a juxtaposition to Spider-Man himself. He could be anybody under a mask, and it's a ski mask. It's just this you know, green ski mask that he pulls over his head, and his main weapon of choice is a shotgun. And, you know, in terms of like how Spider-Man goes about trying to apprehend this villain, it's not just like a situation where, you know, Doc Ock is tearing up downtown New York and Spider-Man swings into action and starts, you know, has to figure out a way how to overcome Doc Ock's tentacles here. Instead, he's like, you know, he's kind of working as a detective here, trying to track down the Sin Eater, because the Sin Eater, despite the fact that he has this kind of, you know, very abrasive style to him, he still is operating in shadow. He's not, you know, just out in the middle of Times Square just shooting at anybody. He's got specific targets, and, you know, you could tell like Spider-Man's trying to figure out like, what's his next target going to be? Who's he going after? You know, what kind of sin is he looking to eradicate? You know, he's going after cops and lawyers and a priest. He kills a priest at one point. Like, who kills a priest? And, you know, like, we have long seen this kind of model in Spider-Man comics, where a villain does something, or even just a regular bad guy does something. Spider-Man swings in, you know, strings him up, puts a note, your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man swings off. And that's just not what we have here. And, you know, you could even say like, oh, this is very similar to the Burglar from Amazing Fantasy 15, because it's just a guy who's doing stuff. But again, like, the Burglar, putting aside Marv Wolfman and Amazing Spider-Man number 200, you know, it's just kind of like a wrong place, wrong time situation with the Burglar. Whereas this, it's like, you know, it's a very thoughtful, for lack of a better phrase, approach to how he goes about committing murder. You know, he's got this righteousness about what he deems as being sinful people in this universe. And like, you know, again, not for nothing, this is stuff that's being like ripped right from like the very real world news. I mean, not necessarily in 1985, although New York was like filled with some pretty like outrageous crime stuff going on in the mid 80s. You know, yeah. I remember being at a panel at New York Comic Con where it was like J.M. DeMatteis and Tom DeFalco and a bunch of them. And they were like, you know, they used to kind of fear for their lives walking to Marvel offices during this era, that they were going to get mugged or worse.
Right, because it was in Times Square, which was like at one point not a great place to be.
Yeah, there wasn't filled with
for
like
different
Elmos,
reasons.
Yeah, Elmos and singing cowboys at this point. So
I mean, like, those things are very scary too.
Very fair, very fair. But the point is, like, this is a kind of like lawlessness and crime and as much as people want to make New York City sound like a hellhole right now, it was nowhere close to what it was in the 80s. Okay, folks. So this is from a lifelong New Yorker. Okay, I assure you, and I was alive for it. It just felt very real, which in the context of this was taking place in the pages of a superhero comic book where the main character wore spandex and a mask, it just felt so unique and different and unlike anything we had seen before. What are your thoughts on Sin Eater as the villain? Do you feel he's well developed? Do you feel he fits into this universe? Like, what's your take?
I mean, far be it for me to criticize a psychopath's motives, but I've always thought like the kind of like motive for who he deems as a sinner was always a little bit thin. Like I can never really track it. It just seemed kind of like I'm going after J. Jonah Jameson because he's a member of Spider-Man's supporting cast, right. And other times, not. And that's fine, like there's a lot of superhero stories where like why is Jameson and Mary Jane always seemingly in trouble with villains, like that you have to operate within that small, soap opera drama. But when you do ground it in something like what the Sin Eater is, I do think there is a little bit more to ask out of the justification for why these actions are happening, and that always felt a little bit thin to me. But on the other end, the characterization is really interesting, and I think it's a good foe for Spider-Man to go up against, even as I'm critical of the portrayal of Spider-Man in the story. I like him as a villain for Spider-Man, even if I don't think he gets a genuine Spider-Man reaction out of him. Like, I would love to read like a redone introductory story between Spider-Man and the Sin Eater, and we kind of got that, in like Manslaughter, or not Manslaughter. Why am I forgetting the guy? Massacre, yeah. We kind of get that there. It's like a spin on the Sin Eater in a way that I find very satisfying. Like I think that story is excellent. I've always been interested in the idea that Stan Carter is ultimately revealed to be a cop, right? Like the Sin Eater is Stan Carter, a cop, because the story is ostensibly about Spider-Man getting revenge for the death of a cop. And the idea that this is not a book that necessarily believes in ACAB, Spider-Man relies on the police throughout his history, right? He webs guys up and leaves it for, the judicial system to handle them. And this is really the one time where he feels like he gets to be, judge, jury, and executioner, which is, again, why it stands out, because it's not really something that he had, really, unless you watch like Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 1, it's not really something that he had been involved in up to this point, unless you count Red Skull's goon that he kills with a missile. But Nick Spencer undid that. So, that didn't happen anymore. But I don't know what my takeaway is about what this book has to say about the police, but I do think it's interesting that choice was made, because it does kind of undercut, can Spider-Man rely on the police entirely? Like, are they just as much operating in their own vigilante justice system as he is, and who determines what's right and what's wrong? Again, interesting ideas. I don't know that Spider-Man is the right platform for that. But I have always thought that reveal of his cop origin is done intentionally, but I don't quite know why. That's just an interesting wrinkle, I think, in the whole thing.
Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about the impetus behind the drama of this story, which is, of course, the death of Jean DeWolf. You alluded to this earlier. I mean, she was introduced in an issue of Marvel Team Up several years prior. I mean, like, I gotta be honest, Dan. I mean, like, I've read a lot of Spider-Man many times over the years, and I can't, outside of her story where she's introduced and this one, can't really think of too many meaningful interactions between Spider-Man and Jean DeWolf. Um, and even just like what you alluded to with the police. I mean, yes, like Spider-Man like relied on the police, but like, there were periods of Spider-Man where he was kind of on the run from police because the death of Norman Osborn, and he was considered a wanted man, and Jonah had kind of turned the police against him. But like at the same time, like I don't know, like if I'm being too glib about this, I apologize. I just feel like Spider-Man's relationship with police was very perfunctory. It was just like you said, like like you guys take care of it. I did this, you do the rest.
I mean, it's just not really analyzed. Like, it's not been a core theme of the book. Like,
right.
Spider-Man is a vigilante, yes, but then he relies on the system to, handle justice. And in the Marvel Universe, they're not very good at that. People go to jail and break out the next day, or fly out because they let them build wings in the jail and then expose them to the open skies, But it's weird that like suddenly this took a front seat, and for whatever Peter David wanted to say about that.
Right. But, in terms of like, and you kind of alluded to this earlier, like Jean DeWolf as an important character in this universe. I mean, like, it's highly debatable. Like, and I'm not saying that like to make the stakes of this book truly worth it, they had to like go after a Mary Jane or a Jonah or something like that. But the fact of the matter is, like, there was very little emotional stakes involved with this character, and instead, like given the journey it takes us on in terms of Peter and his kind of journey to the abyss of his mind over this character, like you're like, wow, like I can't believe that, like, for me personally, I always go back to the fact that like Green Goblin kills Gwen Stacy in ASM 121, and like, like you go into 122 very much with the understanding that Spider-Man, if he captures Norman, is probably going to kill him. And even there, like he's beaten on him, and then he goes, "No, you don't deserve this from me." Like, so the fact that like the death of this character rather than the love of his life at the time drives him to such a dark place. It's very tonally dissident to me. It doesn't make sense. I don't think this character means enough. So instead, it's very much a fridging, because it's like we're just taking this character and bringing her in for the stated case of her dying. And Peter David can say in interviews all till he's blue in the face that like, oh no, I had plans for her. Whatever. I mean, like, those would be the first plans anyone have ever had for Jean DeWolf. So I mean,
I do think he affords her some humanity in the story. Like, there are moments where we get insight into who she was beforehand, but it's not enough. One, to justify where they take Spider-Man, and two, to escape the label of fridging. And I think the art in this book is really great, but I do want to point out, like, I think there's a lot of like really weird sexualized imagery in this comic too. I mean, even the death image of Jean is like her laid back with her breasts like expand, like pointed skyward, and maybe I'm weird, but like when I look at that image, there's many images in this book that really, whether it's Betty or whatever, that really, like, and it might just be Rich's style, in the book, but there is this kind of sexual energy and dehumanization of women in this story that I always like, coupled with the fridging. I can't really like, I think absent the fridging, it wouldn't stand out to me quite so much. But like in conjunction with that, I do feel really icky about the way women are treated in this comic. Especially that, like, we find out that Jean was secretly in love with Spider-Man, as if
Yeah.
she could have any other motivation that might make her character more interesting, but she happens to be like a potential love interest for our hero. And then to put Betty in the way of danger too. It just, there is a kind of violence towards women that, like, yeah, maybe that's the way they want to make Stan Carter kind of like evil, but I always find it really icky just to read it on the page. It makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah, I mean, one of the first big images after Jean's death in 107 is like this, like kind of young woman in a midriff, and like kind of like in the in the center of the page kind of thing. It's very reminiscent of, like, if you were familiar with the crimes of like the Son of Sam, who was basically killing young couples who were making love in cars out in in the suburbs
Yeah.
in the late 1970s and stuff like that. It's, yeah, like you said, I mean, now granted, that kind of ties in with the character, this idea of
Yeah.
like, someone who is killing because he views these people as being sinful, but like it's kind of taking the crime of being an attractive woman who has sex as being the sin, which I know some people will say that, but like it's a lot, I guess, is the bottom line. It's a lot to digest in the context of this comic, especially given what these comics have been at the time. The other
I just
thing
think if it afforded them humanity outside of that, it would
yeah.
escape that criticism. Like I think about something like the movie Zodiac,
Hmm.
and that's a very different medium, but like, anytime they show the Zodiac killer like killing a woman, as was his, MO, like it does go out of way to like present the women in an interesting way that suggests there's more to this character than what we get. And here we open the book, and I mean, it's interesting. We get insights into Jean's mind, right? The book opens, and I don't think we've talked about this yet. Like, it opens with Jean's narration as if
Yes.
we're in her mind and we're learning more about her. So it does try to humanize her immediately, but like, it's all like you're not really even sure that you're reading Jean's perspective at first. And then the first thing we really see of her is just her body,
Yep. Yep. Yep.
It's disorienting, and I kind of respect its narrative ambitions more than I enjoy it. If I'll say
Yeah.
that.
Sure. So the other thing I want to really hone in on here about what this book does is the way it moralizes about crime. This is a very interesting topic to me, because like I feel like we get this to other degrees in other stories in Spider-Man over the year, which is like, so specifically there's this scene in Spectacular 109 where Spider-Man is confronting Wilson Fisk about his potential connections to the Sin Eater, and Fisk is like, well, no, he's not my kind of guy, and the reason why he says that is not even necessarily because of the murders of DeWolf and the judge, but the priests, and Fisk is this oratory about the fact that like killing religious leaders destabilizes communities, and that makes communities harder to control. So here too, ergo, I am not connected to the Sin Eater because I have a more sophisticated way of criming, basically, and it's like, I don't know. It just makes me incredulous. Like not to really make a jump here, but like it always brings me back to the September 11th issue of Spider-Man, where Doctor Doom is crying at the site of the World Trade Center because it's like, well, I've tried to murder millions, but this is a bridge too far. You know what I mean? It's just like like Wilson Fisk, the Kingpin. He is the kingpin of crime in the Marvel universe. He is the center of the mafia or the mob or whatever you want to call it. He is killed and murdered and robbed and stolen indiscriminately since he was first introduced in these comics. So for like him to be like, well, yeah, I've done all that, but this guy is worse. Like, it's just like, I don't know, man. It doesn't work for me. It's just like, crime is crime in my or at least to this point, crime is crime. And if you're going to be introducing like these new layers of crime, I feel like more work has to be done with these characters, and that's not done here. Like it's just lip service. It's telling, not showing, in terms of the storytelling. There, am I ranting about something that is not that deep, Dan, or do you share in this?
I don't know that it like really stood out to me that much. You know, like the Doctor Doom thing is an interesting comparison because it's kind of the opposite end of the spectrum. You know,
Right.
which is to say, like it kind of forgoes the character, and that works for me because that people who read that book like as if it's like some canon, you know, Marvel thing
Right.
are missing the allegorical text. You know, you know, the writers of that in no way are trying to make a statement about Doctor Doom and his character. They're just trying to say like, you know, this is an act of evil, you know, beyond what we can imagine in the pages of a comic book, you know, and like Doctor Doom is the stand-in for that. Whether it was a good decision to do that in the comic, I'll leave to other people to discuss.
We can
not
talk
our
about that in a
topic.
future season,
Yeah.
for sure.
But you know, I think it's tough because like I think we have to acknowledge that like this is a different Kingpin than the one that came before. You know, like this is the Kingpin of the Daredevil comic that's showing up here, not the Spider-Man comic. Like, yeah, the hoo-ha Kingpin would never say a line like this. He was just evil, you know. But I do think that this is in line with the kind of more enriched Kingpin. I think you even see it in the Daredevil TV show where like he has motives. He is a member of this neighborhood in some way. Like there is a deep connection between him and Hell's Kitchen. Like I would be willing to buy that he would say something like this. Does it square up with his like long history in the comics? No, but that's also why I don't like love leaning on canon so hard. Like
Right.
I think this moment could work. But you're right. It is
I
weird.
mean, like, keep in mind, 10 issues earlier, he's like hiring the Spot to like go after Spider-Man.
Fair enough.
Mean, like,
Fair
that's all
enough.
I'm saying.
Fair
Like,
enough.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. In terms of Daredevil, this aligns, but like even within this own book, fairly recent to this story, he's a different character than this. I think that's the bottom.
Totally right. He's like going to like the Black Cat and giving her superpowers, and yeah, I mean, but you know, I guess that's like the slowly fraying edges of Marvel. You know,
Yes,
like it's
yeah.
Stan Lee's not writing everything anymore. You
No,
know?
I know. It's just,
yeah.
you know, I just had to bring it up, and anytime I could talk about Doctor Doom in the 9/11 issue, I'm just going to do it. You know, we got the next
Please
few
don't.
years.
I
I
don't
was
want to
gonna
have
say-
to answer those emails.
Oh, Dan, you're gonna have to answer. I'm sorry. Anyway, but okay, so we'll move on from this because you know I don't feel I have you quite as sold on this, but this is one I think I'm gonna have you sold on, which is the whole
Yeah.
Spider-Man and Daredevil thing here. I mean, like this is kind of like, you know, the when you say like, so what's the moral of the story? It's like it's the Spider-Man and Daredevil dalliance at the end, and like I got to be honest, like this is where I go from being like, okay, this is an interesting Spider-Man story to this is a bad Spider-Man story, because it's just like none of this aligns and adds up for me. I mean, you said it beautifully earlier. It's not like Spider-Man is this fascist character. You know, he's not Batman. You know, like he's not Superman even, if you want to go to that route. I don't know if people think Superman is fascist, but
Even Daredevil engages in these themes more. The idea that like when the law can't solve something, I will don the suit of Daredevil and take it into my own hands, right?
Yeah.
Like that's built into the text in a way
Yeah.
that it's not with Spider-Man.
Yeah, it's having Daredevil have like the higher moral ground in this story, and this isn't just me coming from the attitude of like Spider-Man is some kind of perfect being. He's not. I mean, we have said many times, quoting another J.M. Straczynski story, he is not pure. But like I feel like using Daredevil as kind of like the beacon here is. And like, look, I know that it's meant to be shades of gray because, you know, earlier in the story, Murdoch has an opportunity to save his friend, the judge, and he's more concerned with protecting his secret identity, and therefore the judge gets blown away by the Sin Eater. But like, even still, like, we are led very much to believe that if not for Daredevil and his kind of moral authority in this book, Spider-Man would have made a tragic mistake for which there would be no return for him, beyond, maybe Nick Spencer retconning it. So I mean, what's your take on the whole Daredevil Spider-Man showdown here?
Well, it's funny because like I actually think like this story is playing out better in the pages of Daredevil. I would say right now, but we're about to relaunch the book. But like in the early part of Chip Zdarsky's run, you have Daredevil really wrestling with his role as a costumed vigilante and whether or not like violence, because he accidentally kills someone, although we find out that it really wasn't his fault, not entirely. But like he's wrestling with like, hey, I'm this Catholic, I'm a lawyer, like why do I feel like it's okay to go out and do this stuff? And Spider-Man plays a heavy role in that comic of like showing up and being aggressive with Daredevil, like you killed a guy, who are you? Like we're supposed to be of a higher moral standard. And it's the exact flip of this story, and it works perfectly there. I don't know a single person who's not read any of the Spider-Man appearances in that book and doesn't say like, that's Spider-Man. Like it stands out immediately, especially for the maturity that's present in the character that often doesn't feel present in Spider-Man's own book. Like people often point at the Chip Zdarsky run and go like, why can't that guy write a Spider-Man book? Well, he did, and it wasn't very good. But
hey, he won an Eisner.
He did win an Eisner. Yeah. There were a couple issues that were excellent, but it is funny to like see this exact scenario inverted in the pages of his Daredevil book, and it to just feel as natural as rain, whereas here it just does not fit at all. And I don't know what's going on with Owsley, like at this point in his life, that he feels like this is like an appropriate theme to insert into Spider-Man, whether it be like killing Ned Leeds off page. I mean, like you have it here in the notes, so I'm going to get into it. Like having Spider-Man kill Charlie even accidentally in Spider-Man vs. Wolverine. It's just like that. Like I don't know why that like it is an obsession of his in that book, and I do think that there are repercussions, which we'll get to in the second half of this show, that like the book would post this story and stories like it become obsessed with this dichotomy of like what is Spider-Man's kill code, and I think there weren't many stories, if any, before this where that was even a factor, and I've never really liked that as a Spider-Man theme. Maybe it works in Maximum Carnage, but anyway.
No, I agree. I mean, like, I feel like, we have opened up a Pandora's box of which we still have not truly found an answer to it. And, like, it's not necessarily an answer I'm interested in, not because, like, I want Spider-Man to kill. It's just, like, why are we wasting precious time going through this with, like what you said, for, 30 years prior or 25 years prior, this was never an issue. You know what I mean? But, yeah, like, Owsley, and I think it aligned with what he, part of what made him such a controversial figure, and probably, frankly, not for nothing. And, we got into this during the Hobgoblin trilogy last season, but it's why he clashed so vociferously with DeFalco and Frenz. He was of a different era. I mean, he was a young editor at the time, and the big books at the time were books not like the DeFalco Frenz run, so like he wanted Spider-Man to be like what was the It books on the market, probably. I mean, this is speculation, but it seems to track for sure. I just, I'm glad you brought up like Daredevil in the Zdarsky run, not just because like I haven't read it as closely as you have, but it's just a great point to make. I talked a little bit earlier about, like, again, like my gold standard for how Spider-Man reacts when he's pushed to the edge, which is Amazing Spider-Man number 122. So I don't necessarily need to repeat that. But like, yeah, it just none of this tracks for me. Like, it just feels so foreign, and it's very again, story over character. We like, we needed to get from point A to point B. So how are we going to do that? Well, the only way we can do that, the only way we can make this point is to have these two characters kind of fight it out. And Spider-Man was going to be the one that was going to be on the edge here because this was more personal to him. Although again, like as we said earlier, like how personal truly was it that Jean DeWolf got murdered? I mean, not that he wouldn't care, but we've had other characters get killed, like Ashley Kafka, and Spider-Man's just like, oh, that's a shame, Like, I hate to be glib about it, but what do we think about? Because if there is one thing that I think has been very long-lasting from this story, and I think it's a good thing, but I'd be curious what you think. The fact that Murdoch and Peter know who each other are by the end of the storyline. Like, what's your take on this?
I mean, I think first off, it makes sense.
Yeah.
Like that these two, like first that Matt would figure it out. One, he's smart. Two, he's got super senses. He could tell. Like so that makes sense. It just was going to take a writer to do it. But I like this unique friendship. It also makes sense. They're both like street level pretty much. Matt more than Peter, but they have the same territory as each other, and
yep.
It makes sense that they would be friendly enough to like share their secrets with each other. And I think it's been a very fruitful friendship. Honestly, I wish we got more team up stories between the two of them over the years. And maybe that's what makes it special, is that we are not overdoing it, but they are an interesting pair, and I like it.
Yeah, I mean, even if you make the case that like going in this dark direction is not appropriate for Spider-Man, I feel like at this juncture in time, considering how these characters have kind of grown and evolved, this is the pairing that most makes sense in the way that like Johnny Storm and Peter made sense in the Silver Age, in terms of like the two teen heroes and kind of being both frenemies but also good friends at the end of the day. Like I kind of expect Matt and Peter to have conflict, but that at the end of the day they have a common goal and they see eye to eye. Like you said, they have the same territory, if you will.
Yeah.
So I like, not only do I just like this in general, but like I also feel like this is the best use of like the frenemy trope in the Spider-Man universe at this point in time. Like I can't think like, I know they've tried it with Wolverine too. Daredevil makes far more sense to me than Wolverine.
Yeah, I mean, even just down. I mean, again, to bring up the kill code, like like anytime it's like Punisher or Wolverine, it's an odd fit for the character of Spider-Man to endorse such bloodshed. Even without getting into his complicated feelings about that, it just seems like an odd pairing. You always get that obligatory line that's like, "And no killing this time." Oh man, I really wish I could kill someone, and it's like, what a weird conversation to have. Although I guess maybe it happens all the time on the police force. I don't know. Here I am going all ACAB. But Mark, before we get to our discussions about like the long-term impacts of this story, why don't you tell people where they could have a discussion about their feelings about how wrong we are about the death of Jean DeWolf?
You're like really insisting on like kind of outing us as being bad and wrong here, Dan. But
I mean,
hey.
maybe we're not. Maybe people agree with us. But like I've seen this story like just so praised on the internet. I have to think that we are outliers. As Spider-Man fans. I mean,
well, we have never disagreed with anything on the internet when it comes to Spider-Man, Dan. Anyway, hundreds of listeners like you hang out in our community of Spider-Man fans on the Slack, The amazing Spider Slack community is absolutely free to join, and you can jump into active conversations with awesome people about collecting, conventions, movies, new comics, old comics, and more. In fact, I like to jump in like maybe once or twice a month, which is becoming a running joke on the Slack. But hey, I'm watching y'all, and I don't appreciate when you make jokes about the Mets and don't think I'm going to see it, or when you make jokes about my purchases and you don't think I'm going to see it. I'm seeing it, all right? I'm just not in there every day like my partner here, who can now tell us what else is going on in the Slack besides trying to goad me into becoming a regular contributor.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one of the things that's been going on in the Slack is there's been a lot of discussion over the past couple of weeks with San Diego Comic-Con happening. We found out about the return of Superior Spider-Man with the return of Dan Slott, Ryan Stegman, Giuseppe Camuncoli. Like, the whole team's getting back together again. We got this Superior Spider-Man Returns one-shot, and then the Spider-Man volume that Dan Slott has been doing is ending, and it's being replaced with Superior Spider-Man. Mark, this is often the part of the show where I use the Slack to get you to weigh in publicly on, contemporary Spider-Man things that we don't really have the time to cover on the main show anymore. How did you respond to this reaction? I know the Slack was like a hotbed of excitement and also confusion. What did you make of this announcement? Because, I mean, we're going to have that conversation. Like, are we covering this? Like, we are Superior Spider Talk. Is that coming back?
Are you trying to get me to commit to more content on our episode here, Dan? Because that's a pretty Weasley way to do it. I mean, look, let's see what happens. I mean, we've talked about the Dan Slott run several times already in terms of running its course of expectations and desirability here, but let's see, I guess. I mean, I don't know what to say.
In your blink, like, what's your blink on this? Like, are you excited about this, or is it a very similar appeal, like feeling to like Dan Slott is still doing Spider-Man? Like, because I have feelings about it. Yeah,
I think I'm more of the latter at this point, Dan. I think it's more like, why are we still telling these stories, or why is he still telling these stories? I mean, if I'm being completely honest, like, and like, look, I don't like. We just got through a 4-part arc with Doc Ock. Like, what are we doing as Superior Spider-Man at this point? Like, what do we got to say? I happen to think the Christos Gage Superior Spider-Man comic book series was fun, but it wasn't necessarily necessary. So what is this going to be? So anyway.
I'll be honest, I was really excited about Superior Spider-Man Returns as like a one-shot 10th anniversary thing of remembering something like that I loved, which was the Superior run for all of its warts and, as well, which we've covered extensively on the show. And so, like, revisiting that, it's really fun, especially if you got the artist back in play. Like, that's all really exciting. But, like, the ongoing having Mark Bagley doing it, like, look, I love Mark Bagley, but like, I was excited when it was its own little thing, and now it's like, I don't know that I need to, like, what made that Superior run so great was how unique it was and how singular it was. I don't know why we're returning to this. It's going to need a really, really good, compelling reason for me to want to dip back into the world of Superior in modern context. So we'll see, but the Slack is much more positive on this than I am. So if you want to discuss Superior Spider-Man with us, as Mark and I figure out, like, are we covering this thing because it was our bread and butter, Dan Slott writing Superior Spider-Man, come on, check out the Slack. There's a link in the description of this episode that'll let you sign up for less than a minute. And my favorite thing about it, as everybody on the Slack likes to say, is now that the rest of social media has crumbled and we've got X and all of Threads and all this stuff, the one really great centralized place to talk about Spider-Man, I still believe, is our Slack. So come on, hop on in there and join us. All right, Mark. So we've been kind of like hinting at this all episode, the idea of like talking about like not just this story in a vacuum, but like the long-term impacts of this story in the world of Spider-Man. Now, that's not to say that you can blame this story for everything, or it can get all of the plaudits for all the good things that came out of this. It is just a story on its own and could not foresee the future. But I do think it made enough of a splash that, like, I think you can create very strong, like, you know, whatever, a river delta or whatever you want to say, keep my theme there, of like all the things that like resulted in this and the way that this allowed the character to go that it maybe wouldn't have without this story's existence. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's fun. Like the influence and impact is undeniable. Yet at the same time, I feel like we have received very few stories in terms of tone and structure that are that similar outside of, and you know, this is going to be, you know, this will be next season's discussion, Dan, like Kraven's Last Hunt, which, you know, frankly, probably tops Gene DeWolf in terms of most Spider-Man story lists. But like, you know, it's worth noting with Kraven's Last Hunt that wasn't even written as a Spider-Man story. Initially it was for Wonder Man and then Batman, and then it just worked its way to Spider-Man. And like, I kind of, you know, even though that wasn't the case with this storyline, I do kind of think that's an important point to note, which is like, you know, these stories that like, you know, we have gotten maybe over the years where like, in reality, if you remove Spider-Man from it and just inserted any other hero and it still works, what does that actually mean for storytelling? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like I think that's a problematic thing in its own right, which maybe we can get into when we talk about Kraven's Last Hunt next season. But like, in terms of like bringing this kind of realism into the world, I mean, like, you know, it's just so funny because this is Marvel, the world outside your window, right? But like, it's still a fantasy, and this is not a fantasy. This is very much a nightmare, but a real nightmare. And I don't love the ramifications of that on Spider-Man, because I feel like that has kind of like trickled into it in other ways in terms of his marriage and some of the psychological stories we've gotten, and other deaths and whatnot. I mean, what is your take about the realism?
I mean, I think Spider-Man as a character, like what makes him so strong as a fictional character is that there is a lot of elasticity to him. Like you can put him in a zombie story and he can function, you know. But the key element there is that he's still the same character, just reacting to that, you know, being in a different scenario. I think we've said it many times on the show. I don't think this is the same character. You know, and I think a lot of the stories that were influenced by this would lose sight of like that kind of tonal consistency of like and character consistency of who Spider-Man is. You know, I think personally I would blame this book and this kind of trend of superhero storytelling for a lot of the problems that we would see in the 90s of Spider-Man and that we've been trying to solve ever since. Which is to say, like, this kind of like, you know, say what you will about JMD. Great writer, and I love a lot of his Spider-Man comics, and I really don't like a lot of his Spider-Man comics because they were so focused on this idea of like psychological torture and the physical torture of being Spider-Man, and like kind of like the darker side of the character, and I think you lose Peter's like authentic voice, and like, you know, is this me making a real case for like I like One More Day? No, but like to me, Brand New Day really solved that problem. It was like, oh, here's the tonal, you know, like this is the like not the psychologically tortured, a guy who's not tortured by the weight of his canon and history anymore. At least in the same way. I know it all still happened, but like I think this story is really, you can chart like this story and this trend of comics as where Spider-Man storytelling would go astray, to the point that we're still dealing with it today. You know, like uh, even I think Nick Spencer's run was like largely focused on both undoing this kind of storytelling and being this kind of storytelling itself. And when it's at its best, I think it was not writing like this. And when it was at its worst, it was interested in the Alan Moores of it all, the high level thinking stuff that I just don't think works and spawns from this 80s movement. But would I still like Spider-Man comics if they were still all DeFalco Friends comics? It would have to age up. And
Right.
I think it's the struggle is like Superman stopped, not that it doesn't work, but like people find the character unrelatable from its origins. And maybe Spider-Man's time came due in the 80s where like he didn't work anymore inside the confines of like modern comic book storytelling.
I'm gonna do one of my patented making another kind of pop culture reference to kind of draw an analogy here. You're gonna have to
Okay.
just bear with me, Dan. I know you're gonna hate me for this, but you know.
I'm hanging on, Mark.
All right, but like to me, it's like it's in television terms, it's like The Wire versus Breaking Bad. I mean, both are shows that deal with a high level of like violence and darkness and villains and whatnot. But like, whereas like The Wire is very real and despairing in how it tells its story. Breaking Bad, there are still some fantastical elements to Breaking Bad. And like on a personal level, I prefer Breaking Bad. I know some people that prefer The Wire. And I think like you can kind of point to that kind of analogy with this storyline here. It's like, you know, like, hey, you know, like maybe you want that kind of reality and grimness and despair and in your storytelling. And like, that's your MO. For me personally, like, I mean, the Brand New Day, comparison is perfect because like you said, I mean, there are stories about cops being killed and, you know, stories about celebrity and
Even a
obsessions
serial
and stalking.
killer.
Yeah. But like it's done so in a way where there's still fantasy and like I guess that's part of it for me. It's like I read comic books, I read superhero comic books. Ergo, I read Spider-Man superhero comic books as a form of escape. It is an outlet for me. It is a way to escape the real world. So even when even when stories are allegories or are making comparisons to real world events, like they're, you know, I would say in like 90 to 95% of my Spider-Man stories, there is just enough fantasy to it that it doesn't feel like I'm opening up a newspaper when I'm reading a Spider-Man comic. And this story is very much like, yeah, that you're opening up like, you know, the Daily News or some kind of tabloid or just, you know, it's too real, you know, like it's not, it doesn't track. It doesn't feel like how this universe should feel. Like, you know, I'm not, at no point in this story, you know, go back to like Amazing Spider-Man Annual 1. Am I expecting like Thor and his hammer to fly by? You know, you know, for all we know, the Sin Eater blew Thor away with a shotgun. You know what I mean? Like that's kind of how this book is set up. And that's just too despairing of a world for me to want to invest my time in week after week or month after month or whatever the frequency of your comic book reading is. And, yeah, like I think part of like doesn't work for me about Maximum Carnage, in a similar fashion, it's kind of like none of, you know, we could talk about the fact that like I don't feel like any of those characters, the stakes are ever truly high enough because it's like, who are these people? You know, it's so D-list, you know, they're the Gene DeWolf of villains. Uh, but beyond that, it's just like we're just kind of ruminating, and pontificating about these themes over and over and over again, and trying to be thoughtful and subversive about it, but like you're really not saying anything, because at the end of the day, I'm not escaping. It's, it's hard for me to think if you don't let me escape to think, and this book doesn't really let me escape to think.
And I'll say, for what it's worth, like, Frank Miller did do Spider-Man comics, right? He's those 2 annuals that we've talked about on the show before.
Right.
And neither of those are as dark as this, I mean, granted, like, he didn't write, them, but like they do deal, like, the Dr. Octopus one deals with real world things like nuclear annihilation. But it's done in a very like superhero, hokum kind of way. And, I'd like to think Frank Miller knew that was not the right approach to this particular character. I've also been like referencing, a couple books throughout this conversation, but I didn't really get into them. I think another time that this book got so dark and violent is like after the death of Aunt May, post Civil War, right? And you get something like Back in Black, where Spider-Man dons a black costume and goes in to like beat up and potentially kill the Kingpin. But the reason that story works for me is, one, the stakes are incredibly high. Like, Aunt May is a foundational character to, who Peter is. And the trick of the story is it makes you think that Peter has lost it and gotten unhinged and that he's going to kill the Kingpin, and you're going to finally see Peter break down, like potentially in the death of Jean DeWolf, because you would buy that because Aunt May meant so much. But the reveal is ultimately that he's not there to do that. He's there to humiliate the Kingpin and send a warning by beating him up within an inch of his life and not kill him. That, like, that's not what I do. There is a difference between you and me. But, like, basically, you'd be surprised what you can live through. And so that story is really dark, but I don't think betrays who Peter Parker is and his moral code and how he operates as a vigilante. He webs up Kingpin for the police there, and and I think it was fitting for that era. And the other one that you and I have disagreed on in the past is Spider-Man Reign, which is like, obviously Frank Miller and Klaus Janson are name-checked in that comic, and it is doing, The Dark Knight Returns, but with Spider-Man in it. And you're like, well, Dan, you're a hypocrite. How could you say that this is wrong and that book is right? But I actually think that book is, yes, it is grimdark. It's a one-off story, but I actually think it is a story about how that realm and that environment of story doesn't fit Spider-Man. And by the end of the story, he's redeemed and he's cracking jokes and the whole point of the story is like he doesn't surrender to that world and chooses to be like above it and go back to the kind of story that does fit him. And he becomes the author of his own narrative and is restored in the face of forces that represent grimdark. I mean, literally the bad guy of that story is Venom. It's a pool of blackness, embodying Kingpin, and so it's like, to me, that story is a direct refutation on this hopelessness or the nihilism that you talked about earlier. Like, that is a story that's full of hope, even because Peter's misunderstanding in that story is he thinks that he's failed Mary Jane, but in the end he learns that, like, no, Mary Jane, like, was buried in the costume. Like, she believed in him to the very end, and it's a direct, like, the opposite of The Dark Knight Rises, and that story for Spider-Man should be the opposite. So I don't think I can hold this belief and be a hypocrite. Just to, maybe you can refute all that, but like I do feel like you can put Spider-Man in this environment, but it has to ultimately, whether it ends up there or whatever, like there are a lot of what ifs that go and have Spider-Man's world become a hopeless mess, and that's fine because it's a what if, you know. But if you're dealing with like a institutional Spider-Man comic, I don't think that like that tone fits him in the end.
You know how I would refute that, Dan?
How?
Radioactive sperm.
Whatever. I can get past that, but you apparently cannot, and I get it. Like that's going to turn a lot of people off.
Any other thoughts on Jean DeWolf, Dan?
I think we have expressed our thoughts on this thoroughly, and we'll leave it to our listeners to judge us and maybe call me a hypocrite. So, Mark, why don't you take us home?
Of course, Dan. Well, it is that time, of course, time for all good things to come to an end. So we want to say thank you to you, the listeners and viewers, for tuning in to this episode of The Amazing Spider Talk.
Yeah, this podcast exists because of listener support on Patreon. For only $3.99 a month, you can help support our show's existence while getting early episodes, including new Amazing Spider-Man reviews the same week they release in stores, exclusive artwork, and a ton of other bonuses. So a big thank you to everybody who already supports us and the work that we do. We have no new patrons this week. So, you know, maybe you can help us out, get that ball rolling again.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm sure us giving these controversial episodes is going to help us in that regard. Anyway, to download our earliest episodes, including interviews with legendary creators like J.M. DeMatteis, Tom DeFalco, Ron Frenz, Peter David, Mark Bagley, and many, many more, subscribe to our Amazing Spider Talk Back Issues podcast on Apple Podcasts.
And speaking of Peter David, like, I know that we were like not a big fan of this, but Peter David is in the hospital, at least at the time of the recording of this, and he's seeking like GoFundMe support for his medical bills. And we do want to wish him the best with his health. You know, our opinion of comics is in no way a reflection of, Peter David, the person. I think Mark and I both have a lot of respect for his work and for him as a creator. So I did want to say that, and best wishes to Peter David if he does ever hear this, or anyone in his community does. So Mark, until I pull you back from fully ratioing one of our Twitter trolls after a mutual of ours got caught in the crossfire, what's our motto?
That is an oddly specific intro, Dan.
I should have said X trolls because Twitter doesn't exist anymore.
Well, no, it's X, but also, like, I'm on Twitter, like, once a week now. But anyway, with great podcasts, there must also come the Amazing Spider Talk.